Well, hello, good morning. I'm very happy to be today with Jan Stuhler. He's one of our main speakers at the conference from COES. My name is Sebastián Gallegos. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. And I'm going to be interviewing Jan about his research and about the talk that he gave yesterday in our conference. So we are very happy to have you, Jan, and to talk further about your research. So Jan, could you please tell us a bit about your research and about the talk that you gave us yesterday? If you want to summarize the main points of your presentation.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. So my research that I talked about yesterday is on the question of the labor market impacts of immigration, which has been an important question in economic research for quite a while. And I think there are two reasons why it's important. It's, on the one hand, it's kind of a political, controversial question. And second, it kind of relates very fundamentally to some core questions in labor economics. You know, like how do labor markets adjust if you have new people, new workers arriving? And so I think it's an interesting literature to, both from the political point of view, but also from sort of talking about fundamental economic ideas point of view. And so my talk yesterday, I emphasized two things. One was to what extent do labor market impacts of immigration differ in the regions that are exposed to immigration as opposed to different groups of workers exposed to immigration. And the other part of my talk was on the role of firms in the adjustment to immigration impacts. So let me first explain sort of this first part, like regions versus worker level impacts. And so sort of the evidence that I showed there, which in that case was from a German context, was that we saw that in that context, a kind of immigration event, it's actually kind of like a commuting event where many commuters came from a neighboring country to Germany at a certain point in time. And we see that in response, native employment decreased substantially in these regions exposed to this commuting shock. Now, when you hear this sort of like native employment decrease, that sounds very negative. But then we also show that the existing workers in those regions, the existing native workers in those regions, their employment was very little affected. So not much happened to them. And so we highlight sort of that there is this important distinction of when you study labor market impacts of immigration, but you can actually make the same argument to other type of economic shocks, that it really matters sort of how you design your empirical analysis, what group you're looking at, and sort of the effects of on these type of economic shocks on labor markets as such can be very different from the effects on the workers there are in those labor markets. So one takeaway from that study is that actually the workers that are sort of most affected, or the individuals that are most affected by immigration events, they're maybe not the existing workers. They are the people who were about to enter the labor market. So for example, young labor market entrants, or maybe people who were about to move from one region to another region. So, you know, people who were not in the labor market yet, not in the labor market exposed to immigration yet, but who, now that immigrants arrive, maybe have less access to job opportunities in those areas. And that's kind of an interesting observation, because if you think about sort of trying to figure out what happens to individuals in response to immigration, this means that it's actually quite difficult to answer that question, because if the impact would be mostly on existing workers, then you could follow those workers over time in the data and see what happens to them. But what we see is that the impact is mostly on people who are not on the labor market yet. And then it becomes also harder to study what happened to them over time in response to immigration. Okay, so a lot of that is kind of was a bit sort of methodological. One thing I emphasized yesterday was that one really wants to observe longitudinal data to do this type of analysis, because then you can understand much better to what happens to different types of workers, to regions in response to immigration. The second part of this talk yesterday was on the role of firms. And I mentioned both a study in the German context and another study actually by a former student of mine in the Colombian context. And in both these settings, there was this interesting observation that most of the impact of immigration was seen in small firms, firms and firms that pay relatively low wages. And the idea is that this is the case because in many countries, the immigrants who arrive, they are relatively young, they have often they have less education than the native population, and they sort into jobs that tend to be less paid, less well paid. And for that reason, they often sort into these smaller firms, which tend to be the firms that pay less well. And so in those studies, we see both in the German case and the Colombian case that sort of the labor market impacts of immigration were very concentrated in small firms. And so if we sort of talk about the labor market impacts, there are of course many positive impacts of immigration. But if we talk about the negative impacts, potential negative impacts, I think it's worth to keep in mind that these impacts could be very concentrated in specific type of firms.
Well, that's great. That's a great summary of what I heard yesterday with were more insights about it. So I'm going to ask you about to bring a little bit of speculation to our talk. So we have seen this phenomena of immigration everywhere, and in particular now in Chile, we are also facing this phenomenon because of different external factors. And in this context, where labor markets may be weaker to some extent, what would you think that would happen in an economy in which, you know, informality may be bigger, and labor markets could be weaker as compared to what happened in Germany? So what do you think? I know this is a bit beyond, but you're welcome.
If I may speculate,
yes.
Exactly. No, I think you mentioned it. I think one of the key distinctions is informality, right? That Chile, of course, has a larger informal sector than Germany would have, and I think there the comparison to the Colombian case is very interesting, and to the study that I mentioned. I should mention the author of that study, Lucas Delgado, a former student of mine. So he was very interested in how these immigration shocks, how they affect informal and formal sectors, workers in the informal and informal sector. And my understanding is that in many Latin American countries, that immigration often occurs, in particular, often has large effects on the informal sector. That many migrants work in the informal sector, and that means that maybe the most immediate impacts of immigration are, of course, felt among those workers who work in the informal sector. I think that's fairly clear. What is maybe less obvious, and what's interesting, is how this sort of migration shock, if I may use the term, how that spills over to the formal sector. And that's precisely what Lucas Delgado has been working on. And there's this interesting observation that many smaller firms, I don't know how this is exactly in Chile, you will know more about it, but my expectation is that many smaller firms might be actually employing both formal and informal workers. At least that's the case in Colombia. And that means actually the way this migration shock spills over to the formal labor market is in these small firms. Okay, so essentially these small firms, they have an incentive. If immigration occurs, there are more workers in the informal sector, maybe wages in the informal sector at least temporarily decline. They have an incentive to switch from formal workers to employing informal workers. And that means the formal workers that are most strongly affected are probably the workers in small firms, maybe the workers earning relatively low wages in small firms. I think they are the ones sort of at most at risk of competing with sort of this migration in informal labor markets. Okay, so if you think about policy, of course, sort of the main attention is, I guess, what happens in terms of in the informal sector itself. But if you sort of worry about, what should policy do about the formal sector, that's where I would focus on. I would try to study what happens in these small firms. Is there maybe a shift from formality to informality in these small firms? And is there maybe policies that we can impose to maybe prevent that to some extent, this substitution?
Right. So it seems to me that there are like some kind of important takeaways from your research. So one, it's not that easy to come with good, clean answers to these questions, which are super relevant, but it seems important to have longitudinal data, meaning that it is important to be able to follow workers over time to come with good answers. Second, it seems your research suggests that we should put a special focus on small firms and what is happening there, and probably in the interaction with these small firms in the formal sector with what's going on in the informal sector. So if that's correct, please add anything if you want. And then what would you say are like sort of the big questions that remain unanswered, and where can we make some advancements on this research in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I should mention is that some of these questions that we've been discussing now, they're actually quite controversial in the literature on the labor market impacts of immigration. So if you would have somebody else sitting here today, chances are that some of the answers would be a bit different. And you mentioned kind of why that is the case, because it's very hard to answer this question of what's the labor market impacts of immigration. And the reason for that is that immigration is very much, it sort of course, depends a lot on local economic conditions, on how many migrants come in, right? So you have this problem that it's very hard to distinguish what are the sort of the reasons why migrants come in into the first place from the causal impact of migration on the labor markets that they arrive. And so I think one challenge, unfortunately, in this literature is still really to come to a better consensus of what the labor market impacts are of immigration. And you also mentioned that. I think that has a lot to do with good data. I think one nice thing that has happened in the last decade or so is that for more and more countries, we have better data, we have longitudinal data where we can follow workers over time. We have now, for many countries, administrative data that's based on social security or tax records, where you really have very good information on what's happening, at least in the formal labor market, right? It's sort of another issue is that we probably understand less well what's happening in the informal labor market. So I think one challenge really is still to come to better consensus. And my hope is that this will be possible now that we generally have better data available. I think the other big challenge is kind of course, sort of what are the long-term effects of immigration. So what we discussed so far was a bit more on sort of what happens in the first few years after immigration. And there's sort of this concern that you have this increased labor market competition, that maybe there's sort of some groups of their winners and losers, maybe some native workers are in competition with the immigrants. But of course, at the end of the day, these short-term effects are not the most important thing that we should care about, right? The most important thing we should care about is what is the long-term impact of immigration on the whole society. And there are, of course, strong reasons to expect that these effects are positive. We know that immigrants bring ideas with them. We know that they are more likely to start companies. So we know that there's sort of a relationship between trade and immigration. So there are many reasons to kind of expect the long-term impacts of immigration to be positive. But we have not so much direct evidence on that. And I think that is actually because it's even if it's difficult to say something about the short-term effects, it's even more difficult, methodologically, it's even more difficult to say something about long-term effects, because the type of research designs that we use, they are typically work better in identifying short-term rather than long-term effects. But clearly that is sort of course, like a big challenge that we still have to say more, learn more about the long-term effects of immigration on host economies.
All right, well, that seems hard and challenging, but exciting. You know, that's an avenue to keep doing research and learning about these topics, which are, you know, immigration is an important topic that is having effects everywhere, not only in Europe, in Germany, in the US, but also in Latin America and in Chile. So thanks a lot, Jan. It was great having you. And I think that we all learned a lot about immigration with your research.
Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah.